December 1944. Somewhere in the Ardennes forest. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber huddled in his foxhole, hands trembling from cold and hunger. His unit hadn't received proper rations in 3 days. The Wehrmacht was collapsing, supply lines shattered, but the orders remained: hold the line, fight to the last. Through the morning mist, he spotted something half buried in snow near an abandoned American position. A small brown package. He crawled forward carefully, expecting a booby trap. But it was just a chocolate bar, Swiss chocolate, from the markings. The kind he remembered from before the war, when Germany still had such luxuries. Weber's mouth watered. He hadn't tasted chocolate in over a year. His ration had been reduced to stale bread and thin soup. This bar, probably dropped by a fleeing American, represented more calories than he'd eaten yesterday. He picked it up, felt its weight, looked genuine. The wrapping was correct, the embossed lettering authentic. His training warned him about American tricks, but this was just chocolate, food. He was starving. Weber unwrapped one corner, breaking off a small piece. In that instant, a different German soldier in a different location made the same decision, and another, and another. Across the Western Front, American intelligence was conducting an experiment in psychological warfare so twisted, so ingenious, that it would haunt German troops even though it was never actually deployed. The chocolate bar that Weber held wasn't food. It was an explosive designed to kill anyone who tried to eat it. This is the story of one of World War II's most diabolical weapons, a weapon that looked like comfort, tasted like hope, and exploded like death. Created by the Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence agency, the explosive chocolate represented psychological warfare at its most disturbing. It was never used in combat, but the Germans learned about it. And that knowledge transformed every abandoned supply, every captured ration, every moment of hunger into potential death. The OSS had weaponized the one thing soldiers craved most: food itself. The mathematics were elegant and horrifying. One chocolate bar could kill an officer. The fear of 1,000 chocolate bars could paralyze an entire army. By late 1944, the Office of Strategic Services had moved beyond traditional espionage into the realm of unconventional warfare. While the OSS is remembered for spy networks and sabotage operations, some of its most creative and controversial work involved weapons that violated every conventional understanding of combat. The explosive chocolate was conceived in early 1944 by the OSS Technical Operations Division, a secretive unit responsible for developing gadgets, weapons, and devices for covert operations. This was the group that created exploding coal, poisoned pens, and silent pistols. They operated from a nondescript office building in Washington, D.C., where scientists, engineers, and intelligence officers collaborated on ideas that seemed more suited to fiction than warfare. Major William Donovan, head of the OSS, had given his technical teams a broad mandate: develop weapons that could be used by resistance fighters, saboteurs, and agents operating behind enemy lines. The requirements were specific. Weapons had to be concealable, easy to use, and psychologically effective even if never deployed in large numbers. The chocolate bar idea emerged from a simple observation: German soldiers were hungry. Not battlefield hungry, but genuinely starving hungry. By 1944, Wehrmacht logistics were collapsing. Frontline units received irregular rations. Soldiers foraged constantly, stealing from civilians, scrounging from abandoned positions, and consuming captured enemy supplies whenever possible. This desperation created an opportunity. If food could be weaponized, hungry soldiers would weaponize themselves. The technical challenge was substantial. A chocolate bar bomb had to meet several requirements. It needed to look completely authentic, identical to real chocolate in appearance, weight, and even smell. The explosive charge had to be powerful enough to kill or severely wound at close range. The trigger mechanism had to activate when someone attempted to eat the chocolate, unwrapping it or breaking off a piece. Most challenging, it had to remain stable during storage and handling, not exploding accidentally during deployment. OSS engineers began with genuine Swiss chocolate bars, which were common on both sides of the war. Switzerland, maintaining neutrality, exported chocolate to Germany, Italy, and through various channels to Allied forces. A Swiss chocolate bar found in a combat zone wouldn't immediately arouse suspicion. Both sides had access to such items through various supply channels. The technical team created a thin explosive compound that could be molded to chocolate bar shape and thickness. The compound was a plastic explosive variant, stable enough to handle, but powerful enough to be lethal at point-blank range. A small pressure-sensitive detonator was embedded in the bar, designed to trigger when the chocolate was broken, the natural motion of someone snapping off a piece to eat. The entire device was then coated with a thin layer of real chocolate. This wasn't just camouflage, it was olfactory deception. The chocolate smell was authentic because the outer coating was genuine. The texture, when handled through wrapper, felt correct. The weight matched a real chocolate bar because the explosive compound had been formulated to approximate chocolate's density. The wrapping was perfect reproduction, not a cheap forgery, but an exact duplicate created using printing techniques that matched Swiss manufacturing standards. The foil inner wrapper, the paper outer wrapper, the embossed lettering, all authentic. The result was a device that could pass casual inspection even by someone familiar with Swiss chocolate. Only unwrapping and attempting to eat it would reveal the deadly truth. Field testing occurred at OSS training facilities in Maryland and Virginia. Dummy versions, using inert compounds instead of explosives, were placed in scenarios where trainees, playing the role of hungry soldiers, would encounter them. The success rate was disturbing. Over 80% of trainees who found the chocolate bars attempted to eat them, despite warnings that booby traps might be present. The psychological profile was clear. Hunger overrode caution. Soldiers who carefully checked abandoned buildings for tripwires and examined weapons for sabotage would pick up chocolate and eat it without thorough inspection. Food didn't register as a threat category in combat-trained minds. By late 1944, the OSS had manufactured several thousand explosive chocolate bars. They were packaged in sealed containers, ready for deployment to resistance networks in France, Belgium, and potentially Germany itself. The plan was to distribute them through sabotage channels, placing them where German soldiers would find them, near supply depots, in abandoned vehicles, in areas where German units frequently foraged. But the explosive chocolate was never deployed in combat. The decision to withhold them came from multiple levels of military and political leadership, and the reasons were complex, controversial, and remain partially classified even today. The first objection came from Allied military commanders who argued that weaponizing food violated the laws of war. The Hague Conventions, which governed warfare conduct, had provisions about perfidy, the use of protected symbols or neutral objects to disguise weapons. While food wasn't explicitly protected, the principle was clear. Weapons shouldn't be disguised as harmless necessities.
General Dwight Eisenhower, when briefed on the explosive chocolate, expressed concern about precedent. If the Allies weaponized food, Germany and Japan might retaliate by doing the same. American soldiers would become paranoid about every ration package, every food item found in the field. The psychological burden on troops would be severe. There was also the problem of collateral damage. Explosive chocolate placed in areas where German soldiers foraged would inevitably be found by civilians. French children, Belgian refugees, starving Dutch families. The OSS argued this risk could be managed through careful deployment, but military leadership wasn't convinced. Perhaps most significantly, Allied intelligence realized that knowledge of the explosive chocolate could be as effective as actual deployment. If Germany learned that America had weaponized chocolate, German soldiers would fear every food item from uncertain sources. The psychological impact would spread without a single explosive bar being used. This realization led to one of the war's more unusual intelligence operations. The OSS deliberately leaked information about explosive chocolate to German intelligence through double agents and controlled information channels. Not full technical details, but enough information to be credible and terrifying. The goal was to create fear without creating actual casualties that would invite retaliation. Germany would warn its troops about explosive chocolate. Those warnings would make soldiers suspicious of any food from uncertain sources. The result would be psychological damage without the ethical complications of actually killing hungry soldiers with disguised bombs. German intelligence received the information in November 1944 through multiple channels simultaneously, a sign that suggested deliberate dissemination rather than a security breach. The reports described chocolate bars that exploded when unwrapped or broken. The sourcing was vague enough to seem like genuine classified intelligence rather than planned disinformation. The German High Command faced a dilemma. If the reports were true, their soldiers were in danger from a weapon they'd never anticipated. If the reports were false, reacting too strongly would cause unnecessary panic. They chose a middle path: warn troops about potential danger without creating widespread paranoia. Wehrmacht field instructions issued in December 1944 included a paragraph about suspicious food items. The language was carefully vague. Soldiers should avoid consuming chocolate or other luxury foods found in abandoned positions or suspicious locations. No mention of explosives, just a general warning about potentially dangerous items disguised as food. This restraint didn't prevent rumors from spreading. Soldiers told each other stories about explosive chocolate. The tales grew more elaborate with each retelling. Some claimed entire squads had been killed by chocolate bombs. Others insisted that any food found near American positions was automatically suspect. The psychological impact exceeded what actual deployment might have achieved. German soldiers, already dealing with hunger and supply shortages, now faced the additional burden of suspecting every piece of food they encountered. The lucky find, a ration package, a dropped chocolate bar, became a potential death sentence. This fear was exactly what the OSS had intended. Without killing a single soldier, they had weaponized hunger itself. But the story of explosive chocolate reveals something darker about the progression of warfare. The line between legitimate military tactics and what would later be called terrorism was becoming increasingly blurred. Disguising bombs as food targeted basic human needs, not military capabilities. It was warfare against the psychological state of being human, against hunger, hope, and the desire for small comforts in terrible conditions. American public opinion, when informed about explosive chocolate after the war, was mixed. Some praised the creativity and psychological effectiveness. Others found it disturbing that American intelligence had even conceived such a weapon. The debate previewed larger post-war questions about the ethics of psychological warfare and unconventional weapons. The soldiers who would have been targeted had more straightforward perspectives. Klaus Weber, the German soldier from our opening, survived the war and was interviewed by historians in the 1980s. He recalled the warnings about explosive chocolate and his reaction. "We heard rumors about American chocolate bombs. I never saw one, never knew anyone who encountered one, but the rumors alone were effective. Every time I saw chocolate, even years after the war, I thought about those warnings. The Americans had poisoned something that should have been pure, a small comfort in terrible times. Whether the bombs were real or not didn't matter. The idea was enough to destroy that comfort forever." This perspective reveals the lasting impact of psychological warfare. Even decades later, the fear persisted. The OSS had successfully associated a source of comfort with potential death, and that association couldn't be easily undone. The technical documentation about explosive chocolate remained classified until the 1990s. When finally released, historians and military analysts could study the full scope of the project. The files revealed that OSS engineers had developed multiple variants, not just chocolate, but also explosive cigarettes, explosive pens, and explosive coal that looked identical to normal coal, but would explode when shoveled into a locomotive firebox. This family of disguised explosives represented a systematic approach to sabotage. The goal wasn't mass destruction, but rather the disruption of enemy trust in everyday objects. A locomotive engineer who had seen explosive coal destroy an engine would be paranoid about every lump of coal thereafter. A soldier who knew about explosive chocolate would be suspicious of every ration. The mathematics of psychological warfare favored this approach. 100 explosive devices could create fear in 10,000 soldiers. The ratio of psychological impact to actual weapons was extraordinarily high. But the OSS files also revealed internal debates about ethical boundaries. Some engineers and intelligence officers argued that weaponizing food crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. Memos discussed the moral difference between killing soldiers with obvious weapons versus tricking them to kill themselves by exploiting hunger. One memo, written by an unnamed OSS officer in August 1944, expressed concerns that would resonate for decades. "We are developing weapons that attack basic human needs rather than military capabilities. A soldier can defend against a rifle or grenade. He cannot defend against his own hunger. By weaponizing food, we force the enemy to choose between starvation and potential death by explosive. This seems to violate the principle that warfare should be between combatants, not against human nature itself." This perspective didn't prevent development, but it influenced deployment decisions. The explosive chocolate existed, was manufactured, and was prepared for use, but it remained in storage, never deployed except as a threat, a psychological weapon that functioned through knowledge of its existence rather than actual use. The question of whether explosive chocolate violated the laws of war has never been definitively answered. The Geneva Conventions and Hague Conventions address many forms of prohibited weapons, but disguised explosives occupy a gray area. Booby traps are legal if properly marked. Mines are legal under certain conditions. Is an explosive chocolate bar simply a very small, unconventionally shaped booby trap? Legal scholars have debated this for decades without consensus. Some argue that any weapon becomes legal if used against legitimate military targets. Others contend that weapons that function by exploiting basic human needs, hunger, thirst, need for shelter, are inherently problematic regardless of target. The United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, adopted in 1980, addressed some of these issues. Protocol 2 restricts booby traps and other devices, including any device designed or adapted to be concealed within apparently harmless portable objects. This language would likely prohibit explosive chocolate if interpreted broadly, though the protocol wasn't retroactive and didn't address World War II practices. The broader impact of explosive chocolate extends beyond legal debates. It represented a shift in how militaries thought about psychological warfare. Previous psychological operations had focused on propaganda, leaflets, broadcasts, messages designed to undermine enemy morale. The explosive chocolate represented something different: physical objects designed to create specific psychological states.
This approach would influence Cold War intelligence operations. The CIA, successor to the OSS, developed numerous devices designed to seem harmless while performing covert functions. Listening devices disguised as everyday objects, weapons that looked like ordinary items. The principle established during World War II that psychological impact could be achieved through physical deception became a foundation of Cold War espionage. But there's another dimension to the explosive chocolate story that's often overlooked. It was part of a broader pattern of unconventional weapons targeting German soldiers' morale and psychology. The OSS developed explosive coal designed to look identical to the coal used in German locomotives and industrial facilities. A single lump of explosive coal, when shoveled into a firebox, would explode with enough force to damage the locomotive or industrial equipment. The genius was that it was impossible to distinguish explosive coal from regular coal without sophisticated testing. German railway engineers became paranoid. Every shovel of coal was potentially dangerous. The actual number of sabotage incidents was small, but the psychological impact was massive. Railway workers demanded better security, more inspections, slower operations. The efficiency of the entire German railway system decreased because of fear of a weapon that was rarely actually used. Similarly, the OSS developed explosive fountain pens designed for assassination missions. The pen functioned normally for writing, but contained enough explosive to kill if detonated in someone's pocket. Again, the psychological impact exceeded actual deployment. German officers became suspicious of pens from uncertain sources. The simple act of accepting a gift became fraught with paranoia. The explosive chocolate fit this pattern perfectly. It was designed less for actual battlefield use than for psychological impact through the threat of its existence. By early 1945, as the war in Europe moved toward conclusion, the stockpiles of explosive chocolate remained unused. OSS leadership debated whether to deploy them during the final months, but decided against it. The psychological warfare campaign had succeeded without actual deployment. German soldiers were already fearful. Actually using the devices now would invite retaliation without adding significant military value. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the explosive chocolate bars were quietly destroyed. Military disposal teams detonated them in controlled circumstances. No official records document how many were destroyed, but estimates suggest several thousand units. A few specimens were preserved for technical analysis and historical purposes. These examples eventually found their way into military museums and intelligence agency archives. One example is held by the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., displayed in a case about OSS unconventional weapons. Visitors can see the chocolate bar's perfect camouflage. It looks exactly like an ordinary Swiss chocolate bar until you understand what it really is. The legacy of explosive chocolate extends into modern debates about unconventional warfare. When discussing drone strikes, cyber warfare, and other contemporary military technologies, historians sometimes reference World War II unconventional weapons as precedents. The explosive chocolate represented an early example of warfare that blurred the line between combatant and civilian, between legitimate military target and human vulnerability. Modern special operations forces study OSS psychological warfare techniques, including the explosive chocolate concept. Not because they plan to replicate it, contemporary laws of war and ethical standards have evolved, but because it represents an important case study in how psychological warfare operates. The lesson isn't about disguising explosives as chocolate, it's about understanding how knowledge of a threat can be more powerful than the threat itself. This principle applies to modern terrorism and counterterrorism. A terrorist organization that credibly threatens to poison a food supply doesn't need to actually poison anything. The threat alone creates fear, disrupts society, and forces expensive security measures. Similarly, counterterrorism operations that suggest infiltration of terrorist networks can create paranoia that disrupts operations even without actual infiltration. The explosive chocolate was early psychological warfare that understood these dynamics decades before they became formalized doctrine. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of the explosive chocolate story is what it reveals about the evolution of American intelligence operations. The OSS began as a relatively conventional intelligence agency, focused on gathering information and supporting resistance movements. By 1944, it had evolved into an organization developing weapons that attacked psychological rather than physical targets. This transformation reflected William Donovan's vision of intelligence as a creative, unconventional force. Donovan believed that small teams with innovative ideas could achieve strategic impact disproportionate to their size. The explosive chocolate exemplified this philosophy, a weapon that cost little, required minimal resources, but could potentially influence the behavior of thousands of enemy soldiers. After the war, when the OSS was dissolved and replaced by the CIA, this approach to unconventional warfare continued. The CIA's Technical Services Division developed hundreds of gadgets, weapons, and devices for covert operations, many borrowed directly from OSS precedents, including the explosive chocolate concept. Declassified documents reveal that during the Cold War, various proposals were made to develop updated versions of explosive chocolate for use in different contexts. None apparently reached deployment, but the concept remained in the arsenal of psychological warfare options. The question of whether explosive chocolate was ever actually used in combat remains contentious. Official records say no, it was manufactured but never deployed. However, some historians have noted ambiguous references in OSS mission reports that might suggest small-scale testing or deployment by individual agents without official authorization. One report from early 1945, heavily redacted in its declassified version, mentions successful deployment of Type C devices resulting in enemy casualties. Type C was OSS code for concealed explosive devices, which category included explosive chocolate. But the report gives no details about location, number of casualties, or specific circumstances. This ambiguity may be deliberate. If explosive chocolate was used even in limited circumstances, acknowledging that fact decades later would reopen ethical and legal debates that intelligence agencies would prefer to avoid. What we know with certainty is that the concept was developed, manufactured, and prepared for deployment. Whether it crossed the line from preparation to actual use remains an important historical question. For the German soldiers who survived the war, the explosive chocolate remained a powerful memory. Post-war interviews conducted by military historians reveal consistent themes. Many soldiers remembered warnings about suspicious food. Some claim to have seen explosive chocolate, although these accounts are difficult to verify. All agreed that the warnings had psychological impact that lasted beyond the war. One veteran interviewed in 1987 described how the fear of explosive chocolate affected his unit's behavior.
We were ordered to check all food carefully before consumption, but how do you check chocolate for explosives? You can't X-ray it. You can't test it without breaking it, which was supposedly when it would explode. The only safe approach was to avoid all chocolate from uncertain sources. This meant foregoing one of the few comforts available in combat. The Americans had found a way to make war even more miserable without firing a shot. This testimony captures the essence of psychological warfare. The explosive chocolate succeeded not through actual casualties, but through degradation of morale and quality of life. It forced enemy soldiers to give up small comforts and live with constant suspicion. The ethical implications troubled even some OSS personnel who worked on the project. Post-war interviews with engineers and intelligence officers reveal mixed feelings. Some remained proud of the creative solution to military challenges.
Others expressed regret about participating in development of weapons they considered morally problematic. One engineer, speaking anonymously in a 1975 oral history project, reflected, "We were young, we were at war, and we were told to develop weapons that would help win. Nobody questioned whether disguising bombs as food was ethical. We focused on technical challenges, making it look authentic, ensuring reliable detonation, preventing accidental explosions. Only later did I think about what we'd created. We'd designed a weapon specifically to kill hungry people for the crime of trying to eat. That's troubling regardless of military justification." These reflections capture the moral complexity of unconventional warfare. The people who develop such weapons often face ethical reckonings years or decades later, when the wartime urgency has passed and the full implications become clear. The explosive chocolate story also reveals how weapons development during World War II anticipated later concerns about terrorism. A bomb disguised as chocolate is functionally similar to terrorist tactics that conceal explosives in everyday objects. The difference is context and target, military versus civilian, but the technical and psychological principles are identical. This parallel has made explosive chocolate a case study in discussions about the moral difference between warfare and terrorism. If it's acceptable for military forces to disguise bombs as chocolate when targeting enemy soldiers, why is it terrorism when non-state actors do similar things? The question has no easy answer, but it highlights how World War II blurred ethical boundaries that later generations struggled to clarify. By the 21st century, explosive chocolate had become a historical curiosity, known primarily to military historians and intelligence scholars. Popular awareness was limited. Unlike famous weapons like the atomic bomb or V-2 rocket, explosive chocolate remained obscure despite its interesting story. This changed somewhat with the opening of intelligence agency archives and museums dedicated to espionage history. When the International Spy Museum opened in 2002, its exhibit on OSS operations included explosive chocolate. Visitors were fascinated by the device, its clever design, its psychological purpose, and its morally ambiguous nature. Educational programs about intelligence history now regularly include explosive chocolate as an example of psychological warfare. It provides a tangible case study about how intelligence agencies think creatively about unconventional approaches to military problems. But the full story remains partially hidden. Classified documents about explosive chocolate's development and potential deployment are still restricted. Intelligence agencies argue that some technical details could inform modern terrorist weapon development. Historians argue that 75 years later, the information should be public. This ongoing classification suggests that intelligence agencies believe explosive chocolate remains relevant, not as an actual weapon, but as a concept that shouldn't be fully disclosed. The broader lesson of explosive chocolate is about the nature of psychological warfare. The most effective psychological weapons aren't always those that cause the most casualties. Sometimes the most effective weapon is one that creates fear disproportionate to its actual danger. 1,000 explosive chocolate bars could potentially kill 1,000 soldiers, but knowledge that explosive chocolate existed could make 10,000 soldiers suspicious of every food item they encountered. The psychological impact exceeded the physical capability by an order of magnitude. This principle, that fear is a force multiplier, became foundational to Cold War psychological operations and remains relevant in contemporary conflicts. Modern information warfare often prioritizes creating fear and uncertainty over achieving direct physical effects. The explosive chocolate represented an early physical manifestation of this principle. It was a weapon designed to be feared rather than used, and in that sense it was remarkably successful. In the end, Klaus Weber, our German soldier from the opening, never encountered an actual explosive chocolate bar. The hunger he felt, the fear he experienced, the suspicion of every food item from uncertain sources, all of this resulted from a weapon that existed primarily as a threat. He survived the war, returned to Germany, and lived until 1987. In interviews, he spoke about many aspects of his wartime experience, but he always remembered the warnings about explosive chocolate with particular vividness. They made us afraid of the one thing that might have made war bearable, a moment of sweetness, a taste of normal life, he said. Whether the chocolate bombs were real or not, they took something from us. They made us suspect even small comforts. That's psychological warfare at its most effective and its most cruel. The explosive chocolate was never deployed in combat, but it killed something nonetheless. The possibility of trust, the hope for small pleasures, the illusion that some things remained pure even during war. The German soldiers never knew American chocolate bars were actually explosives designed to kill them, but they feared they were. And that fear accomplished what deployment might not have. It weaponized hunger itself. The chocolate bars remained in storage. The psychological wounds they created were very real, and the ethical questions they raised remain unresolved to this day. In warfare, sometimes the most powerful weapons are the ones that are never actually used.
The explosive chocolate was never deployed, but the fear it created was real. And that's psychological warfare perfected. Subscribe for more secret World War II weapons. Like if this shot you. Comment your thoughts below. Thanks for watching War Rewind.